You have a brain, please start using it. That's going to be the subject of this video on Mercury Exalted. So when Mercury is exalted, we actually might start to use our brain for a change. Now, when I say brain, I mean intellect. I mean intelligence. And you might think, oh, you know, I use my brain all the time. I figure things out. I'm thinking, I'm saying things, but most of what we're doing is not actually using our brain, meaning our intellect, which means where we actually figure something out correctly and understand it correctly, using our discrimination to think through something, and then whether or not we act on that thing is something different, but even just understanding and thinking through things clearly is something that human beings hardly ever do. And in this video, I'm also going to talk about some of the real traps that people get into and the way their brain works, the way your brain works, and how it can trick you and fool you. So again, when I say Mercury being exalted, I'm just using this as an archetype because it shows the highest quality of Mercury and showing how its exaltation sign of Virgo is a very good sort of archetype of the kind of thing that leads to good thinking rather than just sort of emotional thinking or just kind of everything getting blurred together, which is Mercury in Pisces archetype. So again, the Mercury in Virgo shows where we're actually very practical, we're very sensible, we're approaching, data and information with discrimination and in a very practical way, and especially looking for the flaws and looking for the mistakes and looking for the problems in our thoughts. Because again, Virgo as a Tamasic sign is related to destroying what's not correct, and it's also a stressful, fearful sign where we're noticing all of the flaws in the world and in all the details of the world, and we're trying to organize things in the best way possible, because if we let a certain detail get through, that might be the detail that actually kills us, right? So Tamasic signs have this kind of stress and this pressure. Mercury and the lightness and the lightheartedness of Mercury is actually really benefited by that Tamasic nature of Virgo, especially because it also rules it. And so it shows where we take the details seriously. We realize that some details are much more important than others, and we need to take them seriously, not just kind of play around and think and entertain ourselves with all of the ideas we can possibly conjure up. Now again, this is one of the difficult qualities of Mercury, and that playful nature. It's good to say that there's a playful nature that leads us to figuring things out and allowing us to learn, because as everyone knows, if you want people to learn, make it fun. Make learning fun and children will learn. The reverse is also true. If all we're doing is just trying to have fun with things, then we're not really learning things that are serious and correct and important. So this is one of the problems with Mercury. And again, one of the ways that we don't use our brain very well or don't use our intellect very well. Instead, we entertain a bunch of ideas and based on that, form these conclusions that don't really go anywhere, instead of taking things seriously and really focusing on them. And so I've noticed some of the things that we do to kind of entertain ourselves with our own thoughts and consequently not really go forward. I'll use the example actually of even astrology and how, again, I'll just give an example of what I see so much with astrology is this idea that, well, because I also have ideas, those ideas are just as valid and legitimate as the ideas of maybe someone who's been doing it for 15 years and read thousands of charts and been making a living at it in a very deep way and who really understands how it works. Well, but I have ideas too, so what do you say about this? It's like, well, the first thing I say is that you don't really know what you're talking about, to be very blunt about it. And this illusion, and again, it's not because I want to try to sound like myself or other astrologers or, quote, better than you. But again, this is the whole kind of thing that we get into, again, in our mind. That if someone were to actually tell us and be very clear and very direct and just say, well, look, I understand you have these ideas about it, but here's how it really works. And the fact that you're just saying these things with no experience shows that you probably should get more experience, stop talking, and listen more. Again, very powerful Mercury. This exalted Mercury in Virgo, we listen more. We absorb more details than we speak. The details we take in, we take them seriously. And we understand, this might be very serious, and I should take this seriously and really listen to this person, let's say, who has been doing it for 15 years and who has a different experience. We take that seriously, and it becomes something that we understand. We reflect on it, we take it seriously, and we don't just play with a bunch of ideas and have this illusion that just because we have thoughts too, I have my thoughts, you have your thoughts, all thoughts are the same, they're all equally balanced, they're all just as important. Again, they're not. Now again, this quality of seeing things in a relative way is a virtue of Mercury. It is. But again, that needs to be done correctly as well. So again, Mercury is the part of you, the part of all of us, that sees the place of everyone's ideas as being legitimate. Now again, what I just said doesn't mean that a person's ideas aren't legitimate who are just starting or who have formed a lot of ideas and those ideas are correct. It doesn't mean that sort of idea doesn't have its place. It does, but it has its place in its proper place, right? So everyone starts somewhere. Let's say, as far as the astrology learning goes, everyone starts somewhere, and at that point when you're just gathering information, there's a lot that you can know, and that, within the continuum of learning, it has its place. The problem is when that place gets out of sync and it's not in the right context, right? So Mercury is the part of us that understands that even the beginning student has a lot to contribute and says amazing things and has their own unique perspective and voice that is really valuable and really important. And that is the case. I know myself as someone who teaches a lot, I learn more from my students, even very beginning students, than they would ever know. Because, especially if you learn things in their proper order and proper context with the proper, emphasis on the right things, like if you start with elements and gunas and modalities and the proper structure, if you give someone that structure, even a very beginning student can say remarkable and amazing things. But then what happens, again, now I'm going to lead into the next difficulty. What can happen is then, the first thing I already mentioned is the student can then think that their limited information is just as valid as someone's experience and information that's higher. But the other thing that can happen, and this is another issue with Mercury, one of the bigger ones, is this idea that as soon as we get a little bit of information, we have to be careful. It's kind of building on the previous one that thinks, okay, now that I know this thing, even though I haven't practiced it for a very long time, I know it. Again, this is a red flag. You don't know something until you've practiced it and put it into practice and seen it applied. Again, this is also why Mercury is exalted in Virgo, because Virgo is where we apply knowledge. Virgo is literally like applied knowledge, where you apply it to something practical and tangible, right? So we can get into this illusion that, okay, I understand this thing now. I understand, let's say, how planets in signs work. I understand it. So now, but what about, boom. And then we jump right into, but what about, and we move on to the next thing too quickly. And we start building confusion upon confusion. Because first of all, we haven't really totally comprehended the first thing yet. Then we start moving on to the next thing. Okay, but what about this? Because I've gathered this information and now I know this. So what does that mean? Now this is a bigger one. This is called, there are two syndromes. One is called the illusion of knowledge and one is called the I get it already syndrome. They're two of the biggest ones. And the I get it already syndrome kind of leads to the illusion of knowledge. The I get it already syndrome is this part of our brain. It's almost like it's built into our mind that the whole point of listening or gathering any information is so that we can say to ourselves, okay, now I get it, now I get it, I get it already, so what's next? Now what? Now what? Now what? And this constant grabbing toward the next thing when actually we don't get it already. We don't get it already. You don't really get it until you apply it. But even aside from that part, even, with the I get it already syndrome, it's very insidious because just hearing people talk about something that sounds like something we may have already heard can provoke the I get it already syndrome. Let me give you an example. Like for example, even like this video where I say something like, if it would have been called Mercury in Virgo, or, Mercury exalted. Even if I said something, completely revolutionary that you've never heard, part of you will feel like, okay, well, I get that already. I already know that. I know what Mercury is. I know what Virgo is. I've been listening a long time. I get it. When are you going to tell me something new? When are you going to say something I haven't heard? So again, even if I would explain things in ways you have never heard, part of the mind shuts down when you think, like when you're hearing things that you've already heard that kind of sounds like what you've heard before. I'm not saying specifically, but I just mean in general. The mind is going, okay, I get it. I know this now. I get it. I get it. So when are you going to tell me something new? So what happens is when I teach classes, I'll sit there and I'll teach things and I'll say things like this. And I know a lot of these things people don't really understand. They don't comprehend them. It sounds like things they've heard before. So they're thinking, okay, I get it. And then I'll ask, so does anyone have any questions? And no one will say anything. They'll just sit there like, no, I get it. And I'll say, okay, now explain it to me. Then I'll ask them to explain the thing that they apparently already get. I'll say, okay, well then explain to me how, Mercury is exalted in Virgo. Since you get it, explain it to me. And they'll be like, well, I don't know. It's kind of like what you just said. All right, well, what did I say? Let me hear you explain it in your own words. In your own words, explain it. And they won't have one word come out of their mouth. Now, again, that's an extreme example. Many, after hearing these kinds of things, can explain in general what Mercury and Virgo is, but what about the next thing that they are then grasping for? Because they've heard, okay, I get what Mercury and Virgo is, I can explain that, but what about if it's Nichabanga, it's exalted, but then it's with a debilitated planet, and then what about if it's the ruler of a difficult house, but then it also has a good planet with it? What about that? And they'll pile up 15 things on top of each other with this illusion that they understand each one of them. And because they've heard about all of that, they've heard about, and they know, and they do know that, let's say the 12th house is a bad house, and Jupiter is a good planet, and this one is a bad one. They know all of that, and all of these details are kind of rumbling around, but they can't really explain any of those things very well, with a lot of depth, a lot of clarity, in a way that is succinct, distinct, and separate from the other things. And again, this illusion of knowledge then comes forth from this I get it already syndrome, because the I get it already is looking to say, okay, I get it. I understand that thing. I understand that thing. I understand that thing. But what about this thing? Because I get all the other stuff. And again, if I were to ask someone to explain any of that other stuff that they already get, most of the time, they can't explain any of it very well. I know, because I do this all the time. You want to be very careful of this kind of stuff. And again, the exaltation of Mercury and that position, again, Mercury doesn't have to be exalted there, but the exaltation signs and points are archetypes that show us the highest functioning of the planet. So the highest functioning of Mercury is shown by the Virgo nature. The lowest, most difficult is shown by the Pisces, where we have this illusion that we get it, and everything is all just everything else, and it all just blurs together, and it's all just this kind of dreamy thing, and it all just kind of swirls around, and I get to say anything, and it's all my imagination anyway, and nothing is real anyway, and blah, 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 blah. Again, that's beneficial for certain things, especially Venus things. In Venus, that Pisces, everything is dreamy and beautiful, is exalted, because we're supposed to find beauty and joy in anything, especially in the highest metaphysical, because Venus is exalted there. Our beauty and our sense of desire and whatnot needs to be elevated. But Mercury is a whole different function. That's you trying to live your life and understand what the heck is going on. That's what Mercury's trying to... It's the interpretation of things, of what's happening in your world. And if it's all just this big dream world, okay, that might feel good, but you can't pay your bills. You don't understand what people say to you. When you speak, everybody's confused, so you can't express your heart's desire. You don't feel like your voice is heard. Mercury is that voice in your head that you're trying to bring out, and that thing that first starts with you understanding the life you're living on Earth. Not on another planet somewhere, but on Earth. So again, this illusion of knowledge where we hear something that sounds like something else we might have heard, and then we're like, okay, well, I get it. And I get this, and I get this, and I get this, and all these things I get, I understand. I understand what the 12th house is, what Jupiter is, what Mercury is, what this is. But and again, then it leads to the next thing. Because I understand all of this, what about this? Another thing with a difficult Mercury is always pushing to the next thing before we've comprehended anything that we think we know yet. Again, this is the illusion of knowledge that comes from the I get it already syndrome. People always think they get it. So make sure of these things, right? Make sure that the things that you get, you actually get. And that you've gone deeply into them. And we don't really get something until we've researched it and we can explain it. One of the key ways you know whether you get something already is, can you explain it? What does it sound like when you explain it? Does it sound like a bunch of mishmash? Or maybe you don't say anything. Maybe you're just overwhelmed. You can't even, one word won't come out of your mouth. Again, this is what I experience quite a bit. And so this I get it already syndrome leads to this illusion of knowledge, because then you think you understand, but you're more confused at that point than when you started. Again, this is the biggest thing I see with astrology students. They get it, they know everything, they always ask me questions, but then they're more confused. The more details they gather, the more confused they are, because they haven't organized any of it. It's not structured. They haven't really taken it seriously. It's just a kind of game they're playing. And again, there are ways that we play games with all kinds of things, and it's fine. Mercury's the part of us that wants to have fun and be curious, and the very thing that got you into astrology was your curiosity to, it's fun, it's beautiful, it's remarkable, there's so much stuff to learn and to be inquisitive about, right? But at some point, until it becomes serious in you and you start taking it seriously, it's not going to bring anything but confusion and maybe stress, especially if you're drawing a lot of conclusions from these things that are incorrect. You'll have this illusion of knowledge, this illusion of things that you think you understand, but you don't really understand them yet. And the last thing in this video that I'll say is, and that also leads to the what about this? What about this? What's next? Now this thing. Now that I understand all of this based on my I get it already syndrome leading to the illusion of knowledge, what about this next thing? Explain that to me. And again, this whole what's next thing is also, it leads us into, it sort of perpetuates the idea and makes us, rather than go deep into the things that we don't know yet, it perpetuates even more confusion, because we think, well, because I get all these other things and I understand all these other things, I have to learn this extremely complicated, subtle thing. That's why none of it works. That's why I'm still confused, because it's this extremely subtle quality of this thing in this harmonic chart with this yoga from this obscure text. That's the thing I need to learn. So we even become very vulnerable to, teachers or even people or situations that promise this radical, unique thing that nobody else has ever been able to figure out yet. Here it is, and this must be the reason I'm confused, and the reason none of it worked is because of that thing. Because we're always pushing, well, what's next? Need to be very careful of that. And I'll give my experience about something, And again, I've been teaching a long time, and it's quite an experience that, well, like with my certification courses or with other courses that I teach, where I really spend a lot of time organizing information with the handouts, with the structures, with the principles, with the frameworks, not even just within a class, but this class, how it leads to the next class, and the structure which allows people to learn. And the next thing logically, sensibly follows the previous thing, or the next thing follows, the previous thing, in a way where it already answers the questions that people would have, right? It takes a lot to craft, let's say, a course or a curriculum where that happens. And I've noticed now that I've been teaching certification courses for more than 10 years that even when people have questions, they very rarely have any questions about the material that's in the course. Pretty much every question I answer, and that's in all the courses. I've just noticed this myself this last year or so, this last year and a half or two. Very rarely are there any questions about the material that I've actually taught. Pretty much every question is, okay, but what about this? Okay, but what about this? Okay, but what about this? And it's always asking some question about something I've not even taught, I've not even said. It's some projection of something they think they know already in relationship to something else that maybe they've just learned. Okay, well, you said this and I understand this, but then there's also that thing, and then some idea where they're trying to conjure up a connection that's probably not there. And again, I'm not being critical here, I'm just trying to be honest, so that you can look at these traps in your thinking and notice how you're projecting something maybe that's based on something that you haven't figured out yet. And that you're wondering, okay, well, what about this? How does this work? Because there's that thing and there's that thing, but then there's this other thing. How do we bring all that together? This is one of the big questions we also get. And again, it's a big Pisces thing. Okay, so how do we bring all that together? And well, you don't bring it all together. Everything is one specific thing after the next. Again, very Virgo. The best ways of thinking, explaining, and using your rational mind is being very practical. One thing is that thing, and it's only that thing. And in fact, most of the time it has no relation to any other thing. It's just one thing. And that one thing is part of many things that relate to that quality. For example, Mercury. Okay, its deity is Lord Vishnu. It's earthy, it's Rajasic, it's, the minister, it's all kinds of things. All of these things are totally separate. Virgo is an earth sign. It's Tamasic. It's dual. So someone will say, well, how does this quality of Mercury, how do you bridge that between this? You don't bridge it. They're different things. Yes, Mercury is a Rajasic planet. Virgo is a Tamasic sign. Well, how do you bridge that? You don't bridge it. They're two different things that you explain. Well, how do you bridge the idea that you don't? They're just every little precise thing. Notice how that question has come up, and I know it's come up with you a million times for everybody, because this is always what happens. How do you synthesize this idea that this is somehow related to that? It's not. Newsflash. Everything is very different. Even the planets. How do you bring together Mercury and Jupiter? You don't. They're different things, and you explain each one. And you explain them based on these details and all the other stuff that is present. Again, notice how this idea of how do we bridge all this together is a very Pisces thing. And it's the death of Mercury. When we can't manage all the details correctly, which is Virgo, and we can't organize the details correctly, which is Virgo, what does it look like? It looks like some Pisces bridging the things together and blurring it all together. How do I blur it all together? Because the details are just too hard for me to manage. It's too hard for me to stay focused on this, so I just want it to be easier. And please, let's also turn it into a judgment. This is another issue that comes up with that difficult thinking. And you want to understand, this is usually the only thing that confuses people too, is, especially astrologically, there's really one problem that people have when they start gathering more information